I've got a question again. How many of you would say that there is just a song that speaks to you or even for you in your life? You know what I mean? Yeah. There's just this song that says what you need to hear. And maybe sometimes there's even a song that says what you need to say or want to say. And if you're like me, sometimes says it even better than you can. You know, it's like sometimes these lyricists just really stumble across a lyric that just says it so much better than we could say it ourselves. For me, there are many of both. There are many of both. There are many songs that say what I wanted and needed to hear in times of my life, even now. And then there's those songs that say what I needed to say and said it far better than I ever could have. And we've been sharing some of those together. My life probably will definitely end, and it most certainly in many ways begins with music. It's like there's a soundtrack to my life, and what we've been doing together is sharing the soundtrack together. And my telling of my story to you through influential songs in my life. You've heard some of my story now. And does it kind of make sense that, you know, a lot of my memories are very, very unreliable, you know? Very much of my time that we've discussed at this point, and very much of what we'll discuss tonight, I really had to ask people what happened. I had to really search my heart and mind and try to remember things. And I'm not going to promise you that anything that I've told you up to this point has been necessarily right in chronological order, because I don't honestly know that. But I do know that everything that I've said to you is the absolute truth, and that everything that anybody that I've been asking and that you have heard from in an interview standpoint is the absolute truth. God's powerful, and the story speaks for itself. I mean, to me, why would I have to lie? I have Jesus on my side.
Amen. Does
that make sense? Woo! So, yeah. But our first session, if you'll remember, the first song in the soundtrack to my life was...
Stairway to Heaven.
Yeah, we climbed aboard that Stairway to Heaven together, and we did that through the testimony of my daddy and his healing from the DTs and from just a really terrible alcoholic life that was destroying him and destroying our family and scaring us and terrifying us, and had everybody in town walking around the block where we lived just to avoid seeing him on the event that he might have a bad case of a black fanny that day, and nobody wanted to have to deal with him. And yet here comes this little preacher in a little cell when he walks into my house, and my dad says, "I just want the voices to go away." And the preacher says, "You know, I may not be able to tell you how to get rid of the voices, but I can tell you how to find Jesus." And that preacher took his Bible out and he walked my father down the Romans road to salvation. And my father testifies, our mother validates, and I've seen it with my own eyes, that before my father's knee hit the ground, he was saved by the grace of Jesus Christ, and he was delivered from the ailments that had come from his years of substance and alcohol abuse. The next night, we kind of talked more about my story, because if you remember, when I saw my daddy get saved and I saw that miracle, I couldn't wait to get saved. I walked the aisle every week until the preacher finally told me he baptized me. I mean, I was there, you know, I'm pretty sure I was saved between my 5th and 6th year. But I was baptized the summer of my 8th year, the same summer that Elvis died. And I remember that story. And I was baptized that week. Song on my soundtrack to life was "You Can't Kill Rock and Roll." And that's when I began to realize that the one thing that I was the most passionate about, my music, was not going to be acceptable in the churches where we serve. And that was a tough time for me. It was a tough time for my family. And so the church found out I was singing in a rock and roll band, and that was sort of a deal breaker for them. And I went from being the superstar of the youth group to being shunned overnight. And you know, there was never a discussion of it. It was just like doors that were open were then closed. Hearts that were open were then closed. Smiles that were there were then gone. It was just like all of a sudden I didn't exist anymore in that church. And because of that, I got angry. And I chose my passion for music over my passion for Christ. Here's the shame of where I was in my life. Look at me. God is the heart language of everyone who has ever been born. God is the language. His love and grace and mercy and compassion is the language that fills the voids in the hearts and lives of everyone who has ever been born. The band Audio Adrenaline, whose song we've been singing, Ocean Floor Every Night, they've got this absolutely marvelous song called God-Shaped Hole. And what they mean is, every one of us, when we're born, we have this hole in us that only God will fit. We've got this indecipherable need in our hearts that only the language of God will translate. You know? And the heart language of Christ and His compassion in our lives is what causes us to come to Him. It's what causes us to step aboard that stairway to heaven. And then that expression through us is what causes those around us to hear the voice of Christ. But if you become like me and you allow your passions to be skewed, and you allow your anger or your decision making or your mind or anything to get in the way of that, your heart language is bastardized. And you no longer speak for Christ. Your life begins to speak other voices and other sayings. And listen to me. There's only two messages in eternity. The message of the gospel of Christ and the message of the damnation that comes from not hearing that message. The shame of it all is, if you do not worship Christ, you worship the adversary. The third song in the soundtrack of my life was Comfortably Numb. We talked about it last night. Because it spoke to my years of struggling with drugs and alcohol and addiction and anger and violence. But my heart, the same heart that houses that stairway to heaven, was a dark and dangerous place that worshipped rock and roll music in a drug-induced haze. You know? My heart language no longer spoke for Christ. It spoke for Satan. And the devil controls your heart, folks. He controls your heart language. And your life will no longer speak for Christ. It will speak for the enemy and the adversary. I failed to guard my heart, and Satan did exactly that to me. My life spoke for Satan. It shouted for the devil in one of the lyrics that I loved so much as a kid. You remember that old Motley Crue album? My life shouted for the devil. And the shame of it all is that I was a Christian. I don't care if you believe me or not. I'm telling you that I was. I never doubted if I go to heaven or not. Never once. I didn't necessarily have a death wish, but if I died, okay. I really didn't mind. I wasn't suicidal, but death was okay. I could live with it. It's a funny thing. I've said that many times when you think about it. Well, that's ironic. That's okay. I can live with it. Well, now we revisit my story. If you'll remember, the Texas Rangers showed up on that foggy, dark night. I've been awake for days. The streets lit up. I honestly to God thought the aliens were landing on me. In reality, it was the Texas Rangers coming to lock me up for being a drug dealer. You remember?